So my first instinct, which I have to try and fight whenever I finish playing something like just then, is to look up at whoever is near me, particularly a teacher, and look to them for validation with whatever I've just finished playing. Which, as sad as it sounds, is actually the reality for the vast majority of people who take private lessons with a formal instructor. Let me take these off. So like I just said, most people who take private lessons on guitar or any other instrument for that matter wouldn't know what to do without their teacher. I mean, they literally do not know what to think about their own playing without an external source telling them what to think at every turn. But you know what? I don't even blame them. I blame the years of traditional kind of music school thinking that has led people to think that it's wrong to rely on your own ear and to know what you want to hear. That instead, you have to pass on all of your judgment and leave everything up to somebody who is specialized, that knows what they're talking about, and somebody who usually just ends up being a formal teacher. And sure, maybe you don't know as much about playing the guitar as the Berkeley trained guy down the street who's been playing the guitar professionally in Nashville for like 100 years or something. But I don't see why it's wrong to think that you can rely on your own thinking for the music that you want to make. Because look, the simple fact remains, if you don't know how to diagnose your own music making in real time to fix problems that you're having without anybody else helping you, then you aren't actually learning how to play your instrument. The reality is most people that take lessons are actually paying, like 80 to $100 an hour for amounts to a babysitter. And I do mean that because if somebody is actually helping you and teaching you how to become better as a musician, how to play better, then they're going to render themselves obsolete to you relatively quickly in many cases. And in reality, your skill set is the ability to do what you do with music without anybody else having to tell you what is right, what is wrong, and what to listen for. Those are the exact skills that you're supposed to be honing. And if your teacher is teaching you those things, then congratulations, you aren't the person that I'm talking to. But the reality is most private lessons experiences don't actually go down that way for the vast majority of people. Because I hate to break it to you, but if your first instinct when you finish playing a riff or a piece of music or a song or whatever it might be is to break eye contact with your instrument, look up at your teacher and ask them, well, how was it? Then, like me, you've probably been developing the wrong skill set and literally the exact opposite skill set of what you actually need to succeed at making music long term. But the good news is that there is a better way, and I truly believe that anybody can train themselves to be an independent listener and a self-sufficient musician in and of themselves. The truth is that mastery, as in like actually getting better and the thing that most people want to do when they practice, is something that at the top levels really is quite lonely. Like it's usually just an internal echo chamber of isolation, obsession, and basically just pinpointing over and over again the tiny, tiny things that you want to get better at from an internal perspective, not relying on external validation to tell you what to do next. And by outsourcing your actual thinking, the muscles that are responsible for you actually being able to be a self-sufficient artist and music maker are atrophying, and you're only teaching yourself how to be a follower. So if we actually take a look at the model that is used for private lessons for the vast majority of musicians, it's pretty similar to the psychological model that is used in a lot of public school settings. And it's basically just the master-apprentice institutional model. And it's good for what it does, which is producing a kind of templated version of many, many people who can adhere to the same minimum standard. So basically, its entire point is to maintain a preordained structure that is created ahead of time. The problem is that it's optimized for creating the highest number of stability and kind of mass replication rather than actual individual output. The problem with that is when you were talking about making music and making art, the last thing you need is to conform blindly to some previous existing standard. Now, sure, in genres like classical, that is actually something that is quite common, but it's not something that will ever lead to somebody pushing the envelope or being a pioneer in making music. And really, that's not what most people want when they make music. They don't want to just be the same as everybody else, and they don't want to just be blindly following what somebody else is doing without any ability to actually express what they want in their heart, even if they're just a hobbyist. Because usually for people that are hobbyists, they want to be able to make music from their own brain. They want to be able to enjoy the process of making art, not just fit into a pre-designed template robotically. So the basic drawback is that it teaches you to be a passive consumer of information rather than somebody who is actively engaged in solving a problem. And that's actually the same criticism that many people have about many school systems in general. Because in real life, problems are chaotic, they're unpredictable. In order to effectively solve a problem, you have to be somebody who is willing to think outside of the box and somebody who is not so strict and conforming to a pre-existing standard and can instead actually make solutions for the problem that is in front of them. Because like I just said, music often is not contained into a little predetermined box, and it actually requires you to be able to think and have the exact mindset that would honestly make you allergic to just mindless rote repetition. Because what actually happens in most private lessons for guitarists, for example, if you're struggling with a piece of music or a section or whatever it might be, usually the teacher will point out and fix, rightfully so, some small mechanical flaw in your playing, like if you have excessive tension or you're just kind of doing a weird thing with your hand in order to reach notes. But they'll basically tell you that. They'll explain to you what you're doing wrong, and then they'll kind of send you back and hope you can just fix it on your own and basically figure it out from there. And look, to some extent, like, what else are they supposed to do, right? Because when you can't play something, and if something is physically above your level, then there kind of is nothing to do but just play exercises until something clicks and you can actually get there. But there's a big problem with it. And the problem is that it's basically just a cheap dopamine hit for whoever is paying for and taking the lessons. And it gives them that sense of satisfaction, even if they haven't actually done and they have no intention of doing the necessary next steps, which are the personal practice, the focus, and the repetition with their own internal motivation and focus that actually drive their body to create an adaptation to become better. And in like psychology terms, that would be the information acquisition fallacy, which is basically the belief that you learning about something is the same as you actually taking the necessary steps to become a problem solver and to actually do something useful with the application of that information. In reality, most people who are taking lessons and they just get long-winded explanations during a 60-minute session with their teacher about the Lydian scale or whatever, and then they just memorize, oh, that has the sharp 4 in it, and they feel really proud of themselves for doing that. And don't get me wrong, that's a great thing to learn, and you need to know as much theory as you can possibly get your hands on. But that cannot be confused with the actual processes that require you to change your playing long-term. Because if your alternate picking is still broken and your teacher never actually addresses the fact that you have bad habits and that you are actually doing the practice necessary in your own private time to fix them, then those problems are only going to rear their ugly heads later once your bad habits come out and you can't seem to progress within the music that you're playing as it gets faster and more challenging. And you won't know until later because you haven't done the necessary reflection to know that. And also, let's be honest, most people who practice and take lessons only practice on their own private time because they don't want to look silly in front of their teacher and because they have some external commitment that forces them to be disciplined. And the problem with an external boundary of discipline is that it turns practicing into a chore. And at the same time, many people are probably thinking, well, is that a good thing that you have something external that forces you to stick to the routine that you already know you should be doing? And the answer is yes, it actually is for many different types of people, and also especially for young children who really don't have their own internal sense of goal making and having their own sense of achievement. You kind of need to force some external structure and obviously give them plenty of motivation and satisfaction with what they're doing during the process. But the risk with turning practice into an external chore for somebody who is capable of doing otherwise, like a properly developed adult, is that first of all, your subconscious association with practice has the risk of becoming negative. And actually, to some extent, it always sort of will for many people when they are forced to do it externally because they don't want to look bad in front of their teacher. And second, and actually more importantly, is that you lose access to the deep practice flow state that you experience when every ounce of progress that you make is entirely on you, when there are no safety nets, and you know that if you do not take the necessary actions and pay attention to the right metrics in your own practice by yourself, you will not make the progress that you want to see. It makes you entirely accountable and responsible for what it is that you want to do with your music making. And look, I don't want to get super woo-woo or anything, but the reality is that most problems that you're going to face in making music, in trying to be an artist long-term, are going to be problems that you have to deal with on your own and that are chaotic and unpredictable. There really is no system that can save you with a 100% success rate that you can rely on outside of yourself. So now let's talk about the mechanical adaptation that actually happens when you're performing a complex, coordinated task like playing a musical instrument. And the reality is that it really doesn't happen when somebody else points out your mistake after the fact. In reality, it happens when you have a certain intention when you are playing something, a feeling that you know you are trying to achieve. And I talk about physical connection a lot when it comes to playing. And then there is a difference in the execution, and your body kind of flags that internally, and it knows that something has gone wrong because you have internally felt it in real time, not in an abstract sense after the fact with verbal feedback from a teacher. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist either, but I'm going to do my best to try and explain the actual science behind this as well, which is that, of course, when you're performing a complex coordinated task, you are using several neural circuits in your brain to actually try and get your body to accomplish the desired motions that you're trying to make. And the more intensely and actively focused you actually are on the specific motions that you're making, preferably on the correct motions and not burning in the wrong ones, then essentially a microscopic fatty substance called myelin is going to be kind of wrapping around and creating a sheath around the specific neural circuits that you're using in order to make that path more freely accessible and more easy to access next time. And if instead of actually putting your full focus into the act that you're doing in real time of making music, and you're passively splitting your attention between what the teacher is thinking and you're waiting for them to point out after the fact what you've done wrong, then you're essentially just weakening that neural connection that you could be building on your own with more intense focus, brutally dedicated to paying intense attention to what you're doing. So does that mean you should be focusing on the myelin sheath wrapping around your neural circuits in real time as you're practicing? No, probably not. But the reason that I bring that up is because it illustrates a very important point that I harp on over and over again anytime that I'm talking about practice. And that simple truth is that the more focused your repetitions are in real time, the better the results you're going to make long term, period. Because really your brain doesn't have any incentive to change unless it actually flags an error with what you are doing. Or like I said before, basically a mismatch between your intent and the actual execution of what you've done with a section of music. So basically, once you finish using a specific set of neural circuits in order to play a piece of music or whatever, when you're actually consciously aware enough to notice that you've made a mistake or done something wrong, that internal pang of that mismatch is going to kind of just release neuromodulators that are going to actually mark that specific neural circuit for you to recover and make an adaptation during rest and sleep and when you aren't playing. But that only works if you actually do what you need to during your practice session. Because if instead you make a mistake, let's say during a lesson and you're practicing with your teacher, and you either notice it consciously or you don't notice it at all, and you're just waiting for your teacher to point it out after the fact instead of focusing on it intently in the moment, then essentially your teacher is going to have to give that feedback to you in verbal form, and that you're going to have to then translate into a specific kind of physical feedback that they're going to have to go through a long, tedious process of having to explain to you rather than you just being able to feel it on your own sense. And then hopefully you can fix it later and clean up the remaining mess in your practice session. But often it doesn't really work out that way because it's just too difficult to translate exactly what's going on between speech and an actual feeling. So you end up kind of losing a bit of the actual intention behind what your teacher was even saying just because of the fact that it was verbal instead of something that you felt. And I know I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but another thing that private teachers love to do is mask a simple, intuitive concept with just the most complex language that makes you have no idea what they're talking about. Or even if you do know what they're talking about, it just makes it sound more complicated than it is. And really that time could be better spent actually teaching somebody how to do complex, self-directed work on their own time. Instead, if you spend that time teaching somebody the history of a specific type of vibrato or a certain mode or whatever, then you're not really going to be using that time effectively. And again, you're paying $80 an hour for it. So I would think you want your time to actually be helping you get better. And look, I'm as big of a nerd as the next guy, and I love talking about the history of music or random intellectual crap like that too. But if you're using your bandwidth on those things, then your main goal, or what I assume is your main goal, which is actually getting better at playing music, is not going to be progressing at the maximal speed that it could because you just don't have the necessary focus and bandwidth because it's spread too thin. So let me actually make this practical and give you a guide for how I would implement this, because it's not enough to just say that having a teacher is bad or whatever, which by the way isn't even what I'm saying, and then go into the practice room unprepared, lazy, and just not ready to actually put focus into what you're doing. because at that point, you probably would have been better off paying that $400 a month for your babysitter. Anyways, this is a kind of 3-step process that is not the only way to go about this, but it is one that I've used before and that I know works. And it essentially centers around one main goal, and that is to train your internal diagnostic system to be good enough that it renders external validation of what you're doing or whether or not it's working completely redundant, because you already have all the information through the work that you're doing yourself. So step 1, you need to eliminate all of the crutches that you're currently using to mask how you actually sound. And for a guitar player, that's essentially going to be excessive high gain when you don't actually intend to perform with it. That's going to be all of the lush effects and reverb and delay that you have set up in your chain with your EQ. And as much time as you spent setting it up, you're probably not going to want to go too heavy on those effects for what you're actually doing. And finally, you don't want to practice with any backing tracks because you want to be able to hear yourself. Of course, there's a time and place to practice with a backing track, but when you are isolating and figuring out what's going on with your own isolated playing, it doesn't make sense to try and figure out what's going on with 10 other instruments playing in your ear at the same time. And yes, playing this way is going to be hard. It's going to be genuinely uncomfortable because it's going to expose things about your playing that if you don't normally do this type of thing, you will have never heard before. And you're genuinely going to think that you're a bad musician when you first try to create an isolated track and you record it in your DAW and you listen to yourself play without anything else helping make you sound better. You just hear your own isolated signal and you're probably not going to like it. But that's a good thing. That is part of the process. Now, at the same time, you should practice how you actually intend to perform, which means that if you're a metal guitarist, I'm not telling you to turn off the gain, because that is going to do a whole lot of other things for your playing that are going to teach you habits that you're never actually going to use. Because honestly, at least in my opinion, I tend to play with high gain a lot. And I think it exposes more issues than it actually masks, because it forces every single extra bit of extra unnecessary sliding, of fret bleed, of bad string muting to ring out like 3 times as loud and make a horrible screech. It's really, really difficult to play with high gain. Like, that's the truth. Everyone thinks it's some sort of crutch. And again, it can be if you are really bad at controlling your pick attack and your dynamics. But man, I think it's harder to play with high gain. Anyways, for whatever way you intend to perform with your music and whatever type of music you make, you should use the cleanest possible dry signal of that particular sound. So step 2 is to actually audit yourself playing. And as a general habit, you shouldn't probably be practicing long, sprawling sections of music and just playing along with full songs over and over again. Again, there's a time and place to do that, but usually most of the things that actually trip you up when it comes to making mistakes or having a hard section are going to span sections of like no more than 4 to 8 bars. So therefore, you should isolate those sections and work on them individually. Again, you can practice in other ways too, but if you're going to be efficient with your practice and you want to fix the things that actually are screwing you up, usually isolation is going to be the bulk of what you're doing. Anyway, step 1 is to actually capture the sound that you're making within a specific isolated section. So use the best recording device that you have access to, whether it's your DAW if you're recording electric, or your phone, or any other basic microphone is honestly fine. But you want to play through your section maybe 3 to 5 times, and don't restart it. Don't try and fake it and say that take didn't count or anything like that. Literally just check exactly how you play it with 3 to 5 isolated repetitions without any extra crutches, how you intend to perform it, and see what you find. Often it's going to be harder than you think, but the reality of what you hear and what you play is what you actually want to capture, because only with that information can you actually make the necessary corrections to do better. Then the next step is just to listen to what you have just produced. And I like to listen for 3 key metrics when you're listening back with headphones. And again, you want to be able to hear everything that you're doing as best as you can. So usually headphones are going to be best. But you want to first listen for your rhythm, which is basically just your feel, your groove, everything that is related to rhythmic clarity, which is were you centered with the beat? Were you matching the intended groove of how you wanted to play? When you actually listen back, does it carry the sort of urgency or kind of laid backness that you wanted to implement into the track when you played it? You want to know all these things when you're actually listening to it. And next is tension, which again is primarily going to be actually noticed when you're in the act of playing. But just try to notice and think back to your take and think, is there any spot where I had tension and maybe it's actually even audible in the recording, or is there any section where I can maybe do better to actually use the most efficient motions possible and let my body be very loose and supple so that I don't have to use more physical force and effort than is necessary. And then finally, clarity, which is kind of an all-encompassing thing that includes everything that makes it easy to hear the space between notes, especially if there's silence, and just the transitions from note to note. Because if there's extra sound that you don't want to hear, whether it's bad muting, especially on high gain or fret bleed or anything like that, you want to take conscious attention of that and note the potential reasons for why that might have been. And again, that feeds into tension, that feeds into everything that requires you to be physically aware of the sensation during the take as you're playing it, and then you connect that to the actual sounds that you're hearing as you analyze this recording. So those aren't the only qualities you can measure, but that simple trifecta is honestly kind of the three most important factors for most sections, and it's what I tend to use most of the time. But I encourage you to experiment entirely on your own and find things that you want to measure and find things that you think you can improve on that exist either as subcategories of these things that I mentioned or entirely unrelated, because the vast amount of things that you can measure and things that you can optimize for in your music is vast. And really the taste and the judgment that determines what you actually want to optimize for is entirely up to you. So finally, step 3 of this entire kind of practice protocol is correction, which basically just means you're going to identify kind of the most egregious mistakes that you made during the listening section before and just produce basically your best guess of why those things happened and why they occurred in the first place so that you can know how to fix them. So for example, if your transition from note A to note B was sloppy, then your entire world for the next 5 minutes could basically just look like looping those two notes in the transition, again, paying very conscious attention to what you're doing at varying speeds, rhythms, angles, or whatever, until you've kind of figured out an exercise that works that seems to isolate the exact problem that you're having. Because when it comes to actually deciding what specific exercises or strategies you implement to attack a problem, it's really more about what works for you, because the same things won't work for every single person. It's more about what you personally gel with. Now, this entire 3-step process is difficult, like it honestly is, and you do not need to do this. In fact, I don't want you to do this every time that you practice. But what we're trying to do with a process like this is build the internal mechanism that helps us connect what we are hearing to what we are doing with our hands and our instrument. And that is the main thing that you're trying to do when you're trying to improve a coordinated skill, especially something like artistic, like music, where you need to have taste involved in what you're doing. So over time, the ideal is actually that you learn to rely on your own ear in real time. And obviously, often for electric instruments, you're not going to be able to hear the actual raw input of your instrument. You're going to be listening through monitors of some kind. But ultimately, you want to be able to hear what you are doing in real time. You don't want to have to do a process like this to know what is happening. But if you've never done something like this before, the process that I just laid out, then you're going to find things that you really didn't want to hear. You're going to find things with your playing that are really ugly that you did not know were there. Again, like I mentioned before, these things are part of the process, and they are things that you should expect if you're going to try this. Take that as the actual price you're paying to become the musician that you want to be, because it's something that everybody goes through, and even professionals will often hear themselves play, and they'll pick out things that nobody else even hears. They'll think, oh man, that string transition wasn't as good as it could have been, or something else like that. But you don't need to be hyper emotionally attached to the output. Just know that whatever you come up with is going to only give you more data that you can use to help yourself get better. Anyways, just to close off, that kind of fear of not having a teacher is kind of just stemmed from a cultural myth. And that myth is that people who don't practice with teachers and who study on their own are just going to develop bad habits because they don't know what they're doing. And sure, there's a grain of truth to that. Like I said, if you aren't paying attention consciously to what you're doing, then you're better off having a teacher by far. And especially if you really don't know what you're doing, you've never studied anything relating to music before, then it probably is the best thing for you to just study with a teacher. Find somebody good, have them teach you good practice habits, take everything you do and implement it into your own brain. Try to build your own localized understanding of what is going on, and you're going to do great. But think of a bunch of pioneers in guitar like Eddie Van Halen or Jimi Hendrix. Really, they were self-taught. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that they didn't intake from everything that surrounded them, but they were deeply, deeply internal and obsessed. They knew what they wanted to hear. They knew what they wanted to do to get better. And that was the main thing that drove them in every time that they practiced for long, long stretches of time. Everything was done for a purpose and because they had something that they really wanted to improve every time they stepped into the practice room. Not just mindless hours and not just to impress some teacher. Like there was nobody grading them. They had a record player, they had their ear, they had their instrument, and they had problems that they knew they wanted to solve and their own individual unique anatomy and body structure with which to solve them. And that's it. So if you feel so inclined, then do the same. Fire your teacher, record yourself playing, and just become your own master. I'll be here awaiting your results. Anyways, subscribe if you feel like it. I have a newsletter that you can subscribe to, and I'll see you.